Hello, and welcome to the Culture Track at the third annual Python Web Conference. I'm Laura from 6 Feet Up, and I'm thrilled to welcome Eli Holderness as our next presenter.
Hello, everyone. Morning for you, afternoon for me, and welcome to ADHDidn't, or 7 things that wrecked my productivity while I've been working from home. I'm a developer advocate at Anvil, which is a platform for building and deploying web apps entirely in Python, entirely in your browser. This talk is aimed at anyone who has struggled with working from home over the last year, but obviously with a particular bent on the ways that my ADHD has presented those problems to me, and some solutions I've come up with that work well with my ADHD brain. I do say we and you quite a lot throughout this talk, but I want to make it clear that I'm speaking from personal experience and your mileage may vary. If I say something that's not relatable, it's not you, it's me. With that said, let me share my screen for the slides. Actually, before we begin, there are a couple of concepts that I want to make sure that I have talked about clearly before we begin and don't just touch on in passing in a very rambling way throughout the talk. The first is that ADHD people can be very bad at conceptualizing consequences and consistently choosing a short-term benefit over even when it comes with a long-term consequence. One example of this might be choosing to stay up late at night for the short-term benefit of like 5 more minutes watching a YouTube video, despite the long-term consequence of feeling fatigued the next day. Even when you abstractly want to take the long-term benefits and take the boring adult choice, it can be really hard to do that in the moment. And that tendency is something that I've had to factor into all of the solutions that I've tried to come up with to make my life a little bit easier. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is this concept of, because ADHD can be understood as a disorder of attention and a disorder of focus, we can't always focus where we want to. And that means that even if you really do want to get cracking with writing a blog post, writing some code, writing some code review, maybe your brain is just full of unruly attention that is going to distract you. And the slightest thing can send you down a rabbit hole, and suddenly you've got 50 tabs open researching something that's several steps away from where you started. And the way that I try and combat this recurring problem is by trying to absorb some of that extra attention in a way that isn't going to risk dragging the rest of my brain off with it when it goes down a rabbit hole. And I'll talk about some examples of that within the 7 things that I am going to discuss today. With that said, let's talk about the first one. No accountability. If you're in an office environment and you are very obviously not doing your work, there are immediate consequences for that. Someone's going to come over and say, "Why are you playing Minecraft?" While I'm working at home, nobody's going to do that. My fiance might look over my shoulder and say, "Oh, nice castle that you've built there." Because the consequences, they're still real. If I don't do my work and I just play Minecraft for 8 hours a day instead of doing my work, eventually it's going to become apparent, but only once it's too late to fix. The consequences are still there, but they feel much less tangible because they are not immediate. We have to try and find some ways to create consequences for ourselves that will feel real to us to enable us to stay on track. There are also other ways that you can try and prevent this situation from arising in the first place, which the reason that I might want to play Minecraft for 8 hours a day is because I am having trouble focusing, or because of that spare extra brain energy that's often distracting me. Or it might be that I'm really, actually, my brain needs a little bit of a break and I'm handling that in an unhealthy way or a non-productive way. So I've got 3 tips and a caveat to help with this particular problem. The first tip is to get yourself an accountability buddy. This is somebody who you check in with at a regular time, and you say to them, "This is what I've done today. I didn't get as much done as I wanted. I'm actually really proud of the things I did today," however you're doing. It should be somebody for whom you are also fulfilling this function. You are their accountability buddy, so that you don't end up poisoning a friendship with a dynamic of one person constantly nagging another to do work. It should be somebody, or it should go without saying, it shouldn't be someone you work with, because that could create all kinds of complicated dynamics. It should be somebody who will not make you feel judged if you do have to tell them, "Actually, I sat and played Minecraft for 8 hours today." Because as I'm going to touch on later, I really don't want to encourage invoking shame at any point to try and keep yourself on track. And I'll go into a little bit later why I think that's such a bad idea. If you do have to shoulder the social consequences that you've created for yourself of telling your accountability buddy, I played Minecraft for 8 hours a day instead of doing work. The result should be that your accountability buddy, reminds you of the larger context that you do actually want to get your work done, and that you do want to make the adult choice of choosing that long-term benefit over the short-term benefit of doing whatever it is that is leading you to not do your work. They can essentially, you are delegating that kind of executive function to another person and externalizing it and making it a safeguard against you getting lost in your own head and sort of not failing to see that longer term benefit and realizing why you value it. Yeah, that's the first one. The second one is a tip to help with the problem where your brain does just need a break, and whatever way that you're avoiding doing work is actually just a way of your brain trying to enforce that upon you. And if you take, I personally like to set a timer for this. If I take 5 minutes every hour to just get up, do a stretch, maybe do some of those great stretches that Casey was talking about in the lightning talk that he did the other day, to prevent all of the various ergonomic problems that can come with a bad desk setup, which I definitely have. Back on track. Take a short break regularly. It gives your brain space to decompress. It can be really hard to do this when you're working from home for a number of reasons. And that means that sometimes you're going to have to have an external way of making sure you do it. So setting a timer on your phone. Some people like the Pomodoro method for these, and there's a ton of tools out there that you can put into your browser, install on your computer. And it just enforces regular time-boxed breaks where you can maybe guilt-free scroll through Twitter, give your brain a little bit of a rest, and sort of like a pressure valve, try and prevent the situation where your need for decompression time turns into an 8-hour Minecraft break. My third tip is to help with the situation where your brain is just buzzing and ready to distract you, and you're ready to latch onto any kind of distraction in order to kind of avoid doing work. My tip for this is to give that bit of extra brain energy something to occupy itself with. I like to listen to music. Depending on what you do, if you work primarily, I write a lot of blog posts. So that means I don't want to listen to anything that's very lyrically interesting, because otherwise I'll find myself putting lyrics in my blog posts, and most times that's not really a good shout. Classical music, instrumental music, video game music. It's just a way to absorb that extra brain energy. Also, hopefully prevent distractions that might come from your environment. So for example, I don't know, my housemate's having a conversation in the other room, and my brain is so ready for me to want to join that conversation and get away from my work. If I can't hear them because I'm listening to the Halo soundtrack, that forestalls that problem. All right. And now we've got the caveat. The nuclear option in any situation is invoking shame. It's a really tempting thing, or at least I have found in the past, it's a really tempting way to get a lot of work done in a short period of time by telling yourself, oh, I'm going to be such a terrible person if I don't do this. I should feel really ashamed of how little I've got done, or the things that I did do today, such as scrolling through Twitter for 3 hours. And it can give you a real kick in the pants for a short period of time, but I would absolutely recommend, no, I would not recommend using this more than you absolutely need to save your job in a critical situation, because it's a negative, corrosive emotion. And if you associate it with your work, it will eventually destroy your love for your job, and it will not encourage you to do more work in future. It's really hard to take a negative emotion and turn it into a force of positive change. So I would recommend just steering clear of this. And I hope that I am clear that my tips throughout this talk are not meant to rely on the invocation of shame at any point. I would like to encourage, positive thoughts to do with your work and ways to look at overcoming problems as positive change rather than shame about having had those problems in the first place. With that said, we'll move on to part 2. No structure. When you're in an office environment, and you have a structure that's imposed upon you externally. You have the commute to work, you have maybe meetings. So we've got on the right here an example of what my day might look like when I'm in an office. And then on the left, the contrast of a day at home where I feel like I've got an amorphous blob of work to do and time that seems to stretch out, 9 to 5. Well, that's so much time. And it can be really hard to figure out how to do that work in that time. And my solution to this is to try and break up both the work and the time into small enough increments that I can conceptualize it. I have another caveat for this, which is that ADHD brains love plans. It's really tempting to get out your bullet journal, plan your day down to the minute, get color coding, be really specific. You're going to be so productive. But actually, certainly what I find is that the minute I deviate from that carefully laid plan, it all goes out the window. In Yiddish, we have a saying that translates to man makes plans and God laughs. And despite being a genderqueer and not a man, I find that it's been very true for me, except that man is me today and God is me tomorrow. I can make the most elaborate plans, but I know I will not stick to them. So instead, what I've got to do when I'm trying to create structure for myself and recreate that framework within which I can slot my work that I need to do, you've got to take it slowly. You've got to do things one step at a time. And here is a method that I have found has worked for me in creating structure. Institute a daily fixed time event. You can see you've got a picture here with me with an avocado tree that I've grown. I like to take a 10-minute break at about 11 to go and just look at a plant. Go and not think about work. Head empty, just decompressing. And this ties into the tip in part 1 where you take regular breaks. It has to be something you'll enjoy doing. Otherwise you won't do it. And you need to get into the habit of doing this, whatever it is, every day. Do it until it is such a natural part of your routine that you would feel odd without it. Then, and only then, can you start building up work structure and boring tasks that you don't want to do around it. So for example, now I have my plant break that I take at 11. Before that, I need to make sure that my emails are done. And then after that, I have about an hour between that and lunch. And that's an hour where I can fit an hour's worth of work in. And that's a small enough period of time that I can conceive of actually sitting down and working for that long, and it's not daunting and I don't want to run away screaming. So once in this way, you can sequentially build up structure into your day. But the key really is to make it easy on yourself, make it something you're going to want to do. Otherwise, it just will not stick. Building habits is really hard. And thinking about schedule and structure, it leads right into my third point, the third thing that has really stymied me over the last year and something I still really struggle with. And this is sleep schedule. I don't have one. I mean, I get sleep every night, but it's definitely not consistent, and I'm definitely not disciplined at making myself do it properly. There have actually been several studies linking sleep problems with ADHD. There is a tendency towards being a night owl, which I certainly have. And again, it's that short-term benefit of, oh, I'll just stay up a little bit later, you scroll through Twitter a little longer, despite the long-term consequence of having less time in the morning the next day, maybe being fatigued, having a harder time focusing in the mornings. So this is an example of that tendency that I have to account for whenever I try to build solutions for myself with these problems. Obviously, prolonged periods of poor sleep can lead to all kinds of health problems, mental health problems, fatigue. You can Google and find an absolutely horrifying list of things that can happen to you if you don't get good sleep for a long enough period of time. And obviously that's also going to exacerbate every single other issue in this list. So this one is really important and it's really hard. And unfortunately, the advice I have to give is a bunch of really boring sleep hygiene stuff. So I've got 3 things to recommend. And they're boring sleep hygiene stuff, but they are kind of tailored to make them work for my ADHD brain and account for my weaknesses that it gives me. The first is, again, in case you couldn't tell, I rely heavily on timers in my everyday life to keep me on track. An alarm that goes off at 10:30 every evening to remind me to put away all of my screens. And this is one of the hardest things to do for me, because you'll know I love to be on my phone in my bed, scrolling through Twitter, scrolling through Tumblr, checking on Facebook, whatever that I can do to waste time in the evenings. But screens, the reason that the advice to put away screens a while before you try to go to bed is so common is because it actually inhibits the production of melatonin in your body if you are looking at bright screens, and in particular blue tinged screens, which a lot of our LED screens tend to be. And that means that your body doesn't really process that it's nighttime yet and you should be asleep. That, combined with the ADHD tendency towards night owlism, can really snowball. So the alarm that I have that goes off at 10:30 doesn't mean I have to be in bed then. It just means I have to put my screens away, or at least turn them down to the absolute minimum brightness, and I can only have my phone out on its minimum brightness. That's the rule I have for myself. And I'll explain why I don't actually necessarily put my phone away every night in the next point. And then without my screens to keep me interested, without my internet to keep me occupied, I do find myself going to bed within the next half hour, 45 minutes. I might read a book. Some people might use this time to meditate. I knit as well, so I might do some knitting. But it just gives your body that time to understand that it's nighttime and that you really should go to bed and get that long-term benefit of not being quite as fatigued the next morning. My next tip is to listen to something as you fall asleep. Now, I get really bad sleep onset insomnia, which is that phenomenon where you're lying in bed and you really want to go to sleep, but your mind is just racing, and you might be thinking about some awkward social faux pas that you made 2 years ago, or imagining what your life would be like if you were on the ISS right now, or whatever, but you can't sleep. It's that excess brain energy again. It's that stray attention that just can't shut up and let you sleep. And so again, we use sound to occupy it. So again, music that's not very lyrically interesting, that's something that doesn't have a strong beat. I like slow choral music for this. You might have atmospheric movie music. The Inception soundtrack I've used before, works really well. Or perhaps a podcast that you're familiar with. So I think I've listened to all of Sawbones so many times that I could probably quote it in my sleep. And partly that's because I listened to it in my sleep. And what this does is, I used to use YouTube videos for this purpose. And obviously having that screen on was really impacting my quality of sleep. And so I switched over to an audio only solution for that same problem. And this is why I might keep my phone out on the lowest brightness, is so that I can listen to something on it. However, my next tip ties into, if you are going to have your phone out and you're going to use it to listen to something as you fall asleep, it cannot also be your alarm. So this is my alarm clock. It's a Lumi body clock, not sponsored. And I like it for two reasons. One is that I can put it on the other side of my room. And that means that when it goes off in the morning, I have to get out of my duvet nest and walk over and turn it off. And that slight barrier to going back to bed can sometimes be the difference between me getting up and me snoozing. The other barrier to me just snoozing alarm is that its snooze function sucks. I'm always really worried I'm actually just going to turn off the alarm and then it won't ring again in 10 minutes and I'm going to sleep through my day and wake up to 50 messages being like, where were you? We had stand up. So sometimes the lack of a quality feature in a product might be actually why it works for me. And so yeah, its snooze function sucks, and that's why I love it. All right. Number 4, time isn't real and neither are my deadlines. The alternate title for this one for me was that I am feeling disconnected from my colleagues, because to me, I often really benefit from that last minute boost of adrenaline when a deadline is coming up and I can get through a mountain of work. But that depends on you being able to really feel that a deadline is imminent. And often that is provided by being physically in an office with the people around you who are also dependent on that deadline, getting that social feedback and all working together towards a shared target, goal, deadline. We don't have that anymore. We're all working in our own homes, distributed. We are not getting that immediate social feedback that can provide that last minute jolt of adrenaline. And especially with every day sort of seemingly being the same, it can be really easy for these deadlines to creep up on you. And so the way that I have tackled this is to connect more to my colleagues, to those who will be impacted by my work and who will suffer if I fail to meet my deadlines. I heartily encourage this as something that you should do in every job anyway. You should know who your work impacts. You should know the value that it provides to other people. And it can really help you to feel more fulfilled in whatever your role is, if you can understand what you're contributing, whether that's to someone else, to the company as a whole, to your customers, somebody else meaning your colleagues. But so depending on what your role is, yeah, that might be customers, it might be your colleagues, it might be just your boss, but knowing what your work does for other people can help motivate you to stay on top of it more. And this is why I've called it the mum friend override, which is a term I've seen used on quite a lot of neurodivergent communities, where you might be really struggling with something, but as soon as you know that somebody else needs it done, it provides you that extra oomph that you need to get over the hump and just get on with it. And so if we can weaponize and utilize the mum friend override, it can probably solve quite a few problems for us in our work life. Number 5 is a similar but distinct problem where I have felt disconnected from my work over the last year. I certainly felt this. I've worked 2 jobs during lockdown. I certainly felt this really intensely with the first one, where I just wasn't seeing the people who my work impacted. I might have known who they were, but it was hard to understand. It was hard to really feel that my work was helping them, even if I knew it intellectually. And it was very easy to feel that it can be very easy to feel that work that you do at the moment kind of disappears into a big black hole, and you don't really see the impact that it has. And it can be easy to forget what you've done. I don't know how many folks here have had the experience where you have maybe weekly stand up and you get asked what you did over the last week and you just draw a blank, even though you know you've been working. And so the way that I combated this was to keep a work journal, where you can see a page from it here, where I kept track of what I did in a day and who it impacted. And obviously this has got a real synergy with my solution for number 4. Something else that it helped bolster me against that feeling that I wasn't getting anything done or contributing anything. It helped me to identify areas of my work where I got a lot out of it. So one of the items on that list is that I closed a ticket for somebody else. Part of my role in my last job was sort of support work, and noticing that that was something that I liked enough, that I thought was important enough to write it down, helped me identify areas of my job that I enjoyed and maybe do more of them, and combat a feeling that I would, identify whether I really was or was not happy in my job. Because I think with the change in paradigm that working from home, which most of us haven't chosen, has brought about, it can be easy to reassess whether or not you're happy in your role. And this can be a really nice way to look objectively at that. Remind yourself why you like your job, and reassure yourself that the work you're doing, that you've done work and that you've contributed something. And you can also see there's a little doodle there in the corner, and we'll come back to that as well. In fact, in this next point, which is zoning out during meetings. So I have had a lot of meetings during work from home. I've had a lot of remote meetings, and especially if my camera is off and there are no consequences for somebody noticing that I'm zoning out, I'll just zone out. I'll be on Twitter, I'll be doing whatever, I'll be off making myself a cup of coffee maybe, especially if my camera is off and I can't gaze at the tiny square of myself on my screen like Narcissus, it's game over. And this is a problem. There may not be immediate consequences if people can't see you zoning off, but there will be consequences when someone asks you halfway through the meeting, hey, Eli, what were your thoughts on this thing we talked about earlier? And you have to go, because I wasn't listening. So one of the reasons that this happens with me is the extra brain energy, the understimulated part of my brain that craves stimulation. And so I go to Twitter, or I go do something else, or I'm reading whatever special interest tab I have open on Wikipedia. We need to absorb that extra brain energy. However, you can't really use sound to do it if you're in a meeting which is relying on you being able to hear people. So instead, do something tactile that doesn't involve words. So one thing I learned in the last couple of years that completely revolutionized the way that I understand my attention is that you only have one language processor. If you ever notice that it's really hard to listen to somebody and read something else at the same time, that's because your brain only is single-threaded when it comes to language. And that means that if you are doing something during a meeting that involves words, you're not going to be able to listen to the words that are in meeting. So whatever you do to absorb that extra brain energy can't use words. So you could do a Sudoku, but not a crossword. I'm a knitter. I've got some examples on this slide, as you can see. I'm a knitter. I love to knit. Some of you might see me in the face-to-face meetings, with knitting the scarf that will never end. I don't actually recommend balloon animals. If they pop unexpectedly, it can be quite disruptive. I'm really pleased I got a picture of a coloring book in here, because in the swag bag for this conference that I got, there was a little notepad on the bottom with these beautiful little geometric patterns, perfect for coloring in. And thinking of notepads, this technique is dependent on the culture at your work. I've got a friend whose colleagues think that it is the absolute height of rudeness for them to be doing a Sudoku during a meeting instead of making awkward eye contact with the camera constantly, I guess. And luckily that friend has moved to a more cameras off culture. But one thing you can do if your work culture won't permit something like knitting or using a fidget toy, this is the exact problem that ADHD fidget toys are designed to combat. If your work culture won't permit that, though, you can take notes in hard copy. And that way you are processing language, but you are processing the right language, the language of the meeting. And it can sometimes come in really clutch, actually. Sometimes there's a 3-hour design meeting that I was part of almost a year ago now. And lots of things were said, and I was taking notes. And when people circled back around to something, I was able to go, oh, but we mentioned this earlier, doesn't that solve that problem? And it actually helped to have somebody keeping minutes almost. And that's a way to keep your hands busy, give your brain a little bit of extra stimulation so that that extra brain energy you have doesn't go off down a rabbit hole and drag the rest of you with it. Right, the last point on my list, number 7. I don't exercise. Straight up, just don't do it. When I was working in the office, I had to get to the office and I cycled. So this externally imposed structure of my day contained exercise, and therefore I did it. Now, this is something that Mason Egger talked about in his fantastic talk yesterday about working from home. If you are living your life within the 4 walls of your house, you're going to do far less walking, for one. And let's say that you used to go to the gym and now your gym is closed because everything's closed. You're not getting that exercise anymore. And this really ties into for me, the structure issue, where if it's not part of my structure, I'm not doing it because it takes so much mental energy to remember that I have to do it. And I also have the extra hurdle of just not being a person who enjoys exercise, really. And that's my own personal problem to deal with. But it's one that I have to factor into my solutions. And as with the technique for building structure in your life, the trick is to make it as absolutely easy on yourself as possible, as enjoyable on yourself as possible, and just make it something that you will enjoy doing so that you do it. One thing I do is I boil my kettle to make my coffee twice a day. I have 2 coffees a day. It's part of my structure that I have to impose on myself. And I do squats while I'm waiting for the kettle to boil, because that's a dead minute that I wouldn't be spending doing anything productive otherwise. That's not really enough time to even do some washing up. So I do 2 minutes of squats a day. It's better than nothing. But it's an example of trying to do something little and often and make it a part of a routine. And in this case, that example of that strategy of having a fixed time thing that you enjoy, that then you can hang less enjoyable things off of. My coffee is something I enjoy. It's a nice little ritual where I go into the kitchen, I make myself a coffee, and I can hang the exercise task off that anchor point of this nice ritual that I enjoy. One thing that's really important that I talked about earlier is it's really easy to fall into a shame spiral about how much exercise you are or aren't doing, especially with so many societal pressures and particularly, beauty culture and how much exercise you're doing. I'm not looking forward to the swathe of articles on, oh, lose your coronavirus 15 pounds or whatever. Don't invoke shame, because it won't make you want to exercise more. It'll just make you feel bad. Be like Winnie. Winnie has never known shame. You can see him doing some nice stretches there. It should be something, I find that I function best when I think about doing exercise to take care of my body. When I think about it in that way, I'm doing it something for my well-being that's going to make me more effective in every other area of my life. It's going to make me feel better. And I've managed to maintain my squats while doing coffee. Maybe one day I'll build up to something more, but for now I have maintained that habit, and that's pretty good going, to be honest. I am looking forward to going back to the office when I will be forced to do more meaningful exercise though. All right, so those were my 7 things, and just as we wrap up, I'd like to recap the main themes that I hope have been coming through as I talk, and they are: choose long-term over short-term benefits. Uninstall Minecraft if you have to. Make it easy for yourself to make the useful, adult, boring, beneficial choice. In whatever way you have to. So uninstalling Minecraft. Unconventional when it comes to, maybe people would tell me to exercise more restraint, but actually you do what works for you and you find a way to make your own life easier in that way. Absorb your extra energy. It can be really hard to notice when that is the thing that's pulling you off track. But once you do, and it's a habit that you can develop and a skill you can learn, to be a little bit introspective and notice that actually I keep getting distracted by something. Maybe I should put on some music, or do some knitting while I'm listening to this meeting or this talk. I've got a lot of knitting done during this past conference. And every single time you do it, you are reinforcing that habit, and unlearning the habit of going down a rabbit hole when your brain is trying to distract you. And last thing, don't invoke shame. It's just not worth it. The last year has been hard for a lot of people. We didn't choose work from home. And despite the fact that in technology, we might have been very lucky to be able to make that transition easier than some other industries, it doesn't mean that things haven't still been difficult. You should cut yourself a bit of slack. And instead of beating yourself up for ways you may or may not have struggled to work from home over the last year, take a step back and see if you can find ways, whether or not they're a bit unorthodox, to make your life easier. And that's me. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you very much to Python WebConf for having me.